For 30 years, I chose silence. I believed that silence would preserve happiness, would preserve family. But I was wrong. Silence only fed the darkness. And one day, that darkness came back to devour me whole. That night, in the suffocating living room, Victor slammed his hand on the table and roared, "Are you trying to destroy me, Nora?" The USB trembled violently beneath his hand, like an undeniable witness. I lifted my head, looked straight into the eyes of the man who had once been my whole world, and calmly replied, "No, Victor, you destroyed yourself. I only let the light expose the truth. I am Nora Davis." And from that moment, my life turned onto a different path, a journey from the shadow of silence to becoming a woman who dares to step into the light. If you're watching this video, please like, subscribe, and let me know in the comments where you're listening from. I'd be so happy to connect with you. I still remember that night vividly. Golden lights spilled down the grand hall of the luxurious hotel, where banners celebrated the 30th anniversary of Davis Corporation. Guests in evening gowns and tailored suits raised their glasses in toast. They called my husband a model businessman, a man who built success with his bare hands. Each compliment rang out like fireworks, and Victor inhaled them as if they were oxygen. I sat at the banquet table, my navy blue dress hugging a figure no longer that of my 20s. Yet I told myself I still carried elegance. Beside me, my daughter Elena forced a measured smile, both proud and weary. She had worked day and night to prepare this event and now only hoped her father wouldn't go too far. My son Andrew, on the other hand, beamed with ease, his eyes lighting up every time someone mentioned shares, inheritance, or succession. Then came Victor's turn to step onto the stage. He wore a black tuxedo, chest puffed like a conquering general. A glass of wine gleamed in his hand. 30 years, he began, his deep voice echoing. I have poured my heart into making Davis Corporation the pride of this community. Thunderous applause erupted. I smiled faintly, but inside I heard only the heavy, ticking sound of a clock. I had listened to speeches like this 100 times, the words he rehearsed before the mirror, with the same familiar gestures. Once, I had felt proud, but tonight, I felt only estrangement. Victor took another sip of wine. Swaying slightly from overexcitement, he clicked the remote, intending to show the company's commemorative slides. But instead of solemn images, the big screen suddenly displayed an email window. Some guests chuckled, thinking he'd pressed the wrong button. I held my breath. Lines of text appeared, bold and undeniable, not company material. I miss you from last night. You make me feel young again. It's unbearable standing next to my wife pretending. Meet me at the usual hotel. The hall fell into silence as though someone had snuffed out every sound. Only the trickle of wine into glasses and sharp intakes of breath remained. I heard whispers from the table behind. Oh God, is that a private email? Victor's face drained of color. He fumbled frantically with the remote, but it was too late. The entire ballroom had seen it. Julia, Elena's young assistant, sat at a table near the stage, her face pale, lips trembling. Elena froze, gripping her napkin tight. I felt blood rush to my face, not from shame, but from fury. Not fury for myself, but for my daughter, humiliated before her colleagues and friends. Victor cleared his throat, forcing a laugh. Apologies, a technical glitch. Then he dropped his shoulders, as if deciding to salvage his dignity with a confession. But perhaps it's time I made it public. I have found a new love. Gasps swept through the hall. Julia. He turned, extending his hand toward her. Julia Carter. Elena dropped her glass, shards shattering at her feet. Julia stammered, "Please, don't." But her voice faltered. All eyes fell on her, torn between shock and curiosity. I sat motionless, back straight, saying nothing. An old memory flashed, the day Victor proposed, his hand trembling as he slipped on the ring, whispering, "I will never hurt you." That promise now echoed. Bitter as the sound of breaking glass, Elena remained stiff as stone. Her face, usually radiant with confidence and intelligence, suddenly dimmed, stripped of its light. I saw her lips quiver, as if words were trapped inside, swallowed back because Julia was her assistant. The name her father had spoken was not only a betrayal of family, but also a slap to Elena's professional pride. Her hand clenched so tightly her nails cut into her palm. Tears brimmed in her eyes, but she forced them back. In that moment, I wanted to wrap my daughter in my arms, shielding her from the stares, the cruel whispers swirling around the banquet. But I knew if I stood up, she would break down then and there. She needed me strong, silent at least for tonight. Across the table, Andrew's reaction was starkly different. He was startled, yes, but not wounded like his sister. I caught the gleam in his eyes, a glimmer I had seen before in Victor's when he was young. The glimmer of ambition. What about the shares Dad promised me? I could almost hear Andrew's thought. He watched his father with calculating eyes, as though marital betrayal mattered little compared to one question. Does his promise still stand? My heart clenched. I loved my son, but I recognized the danger in that look. He was standing at the mouth of the same path Victor had walked, the path of power and gain, where family was only a costume for honor. Victor, still on stage, remained oblivious to the deadly silence in the room. He raised his glass high, feigning triumph. 30 years, and tonight I choose to begin a new chapter of my life. His voice boomed, yet hollow as never before. Below, Julia forced a brittle smile. I saw her hands tremble, her eyes unsettled. I knew she hadn't expected this. She was his mistress, yes, but also a victim of Victor's recklessness and vanity. Now, under hundreds of condemning eyes, Julia had been dragged out as a public spectacle. And me? I sat there, still as a lake, letting the gazes wash over me. They waited for me to weep, to slap my husband, to stage a dramatic scene. But I only set down my wine glass and gave a faint smile, not because I was weak, but because I had realized one truth. If I wanted to survive this storm, I could not be swept into it. Memories flickered in my mind. The years I gave up my dream of an art gallery, to be Victor's foundation. The countless nights I waited in an empty house while he was entertaining clients. The times I swallowed conflict, thinking peace was the best gift to family. But in this moment, I saw clearly. Past silence had made me a shadow. And now, this deliberate silence would be my sharpest weapon. A guest near me whispered, "My God, she's so calm." I heard it, but did not respond. They didn't know that in the small clutch I carried tonight, there was more than lipstick and tissues. There was something Victor had no idea about, a USB holding the truth he thought hidden. I lifted my gaze and met Elena's eyes. She looked at me, searching for a signal. I gave a small nod, not of comfort, but to say, "I'm in control. Do not fear." Victor kept talking, but to me his voice was nothing more than a distant echo. In that ballroom, he thought himself the man of power, but I knew the truth. Tonight, he had laid the first stone of his own downfall, and I, Nora Davis, would be the one to write the rest of the story. I could feel the air in that grand hall thick enough to suffocate. Hundreds of eyes were pinned on me, waiting for the reaction they believed inevitable. Tears, an outburst of rage, or at the very least, a public collapse of dignity. I heard the whispers right by my ear. "She'll storm out any second." If I were her, I'd have slapped him across the face already. But I simply sat there, my back straight, the corner of my lips curving into a faint smile. A smile not of happiness, but of choice. If Victor wanted to drag me into his theater under the spotlight, then I would answer with a performance of my own. I rose deliberately, lifting the glass of wine from the table. The hall fell utterly silent. Victor stopped speaking, perhaps thinking I would finally erupt. Instead, I raised my glass and spoke clearly. "Congratulations on your bravery, Victor." There were murmurs, a few awkward coughs. I saw Victor stiffen, his hand gripping the microphone so tightly the veins in his fist bulged. A flicker of unease flashed in his eyes, quickly masked by a strained smile. Julia, seated below, turned toward me, bewilderment in her gaze, as though she couldn't understand my words. I set my glass gently back on the table and drew from my small clutch a neat square box. Black velvet. I opened it and placed it atop the white tablecloth. The click of the lid opening cracked through the silence like something breaking. Victor caught sight of it. His hand trembled briefly before he hid it. But I had already seen. Julia leaned forward, her wide eyes filled with both curiosity and dread. Elena stared at the box, then at me, her look asking silently, "Mother, what is that?" I didn't answer with words. I only gave her a slight smile. In that moment, I knew Elena needed to see her mother unshaken. She needed to believe that no matter how the world turned upside down, I was still standing firm. Victor tried to reclaim his authority, sneering into the microphone. "Well, Nora, what trick are you playing now? Shouldn't you be at home, minding the kitchen?" A few guests let out forced laughter, but it died quickly. No one wanted to side with him anymore. I tilted my head slightly, replying in a soft voice that carried across the hall. "Don't worry, Victor. Tonight I've only brought a keepsake for your big day." I sat back down, resting my hand atop the box but not opening it. The drawn-out silence became a chess game. I left him to imagine, left Julia to doubt, left the room to weave its own theories. A memory surfaced. More than 30 years ago, in another room lit with chandeliers, I had stood beside Victor at the launch of his first company. He had gripped my hand tightly and whispered, "We'll walk this road together until the end." I had believed him. I had even given up my dream of owning an art gallery, trusting that my sacrifices would bring us family happiness. Now, under the same blinding lights, he stood before me again, but this time, I was no longer his obedient shadow. Victor swallowed hard, turning away as if to ignore the box. But I saw his shoulders tense. Julia cast him a glance, half desperate to ask, half terrified to know. Andrew frowned, eyes glittering with intrigue, already calculating if the contents had anything to do with his inheritance. And me? I just sat there, smiling, silent, but heavy with meaning. I felt Elena's eyes fixed on me. When I sat back down beside her, she turned toward me, her eyes wet but burning bright. In them I read admiration mingled with relief. My daughter had braced herself for chaos, but instead she witnessed her mother calm, and even leading the scene. She whispered, her voice trembling, "Mom, how can you stay so calm?" I smiled, taking her shaking hand in mine. I leaned down and answered softly, just enough for her to hear. "Because I know you need to see me standing strong. No one is allowed to ruin your day, not even your father." Elena bit her lip as if she might cry, but instead she nodded, a slow, resolute nod, as if in that moment she realized she was no longer alone. Across the table, Andrew was entirely different. My son frowned, his eyes darting from Victor to me, from the black box to Julia's anxious face. He seemed torn, pulled between two worlds. The father who had promised him company shares, and the mother who had just revealed her strength. I saw his lips press tightly together, a flicker of greed in his eyes, followed quickly by confusion. He whispered, almost unable to contain himself, "What's in the box, Mom?" I simply shook my head, offering no answer, not because I meant to hide it from him, but because I knew he wasn't ready to understand. Victor was still on stage, clinging to whatever pride he had left. He raised his glass high, his voice straining with false certainty. "No matter what, I am still the one steering this company." A few guests clapped half-heartedly, but the sound rang hollow, lifeless. I could see it clearly, Victor's hands trembling, his glass unsteady, his mask of confidence cracking piece by piece. I turned to my daughter, resting a hand on her shoulder. My voice was firm enough for her to remember forever, yet low enough that no one else could hear. "This is still your day, Elena. You worked for it. You deserved to see the outcome. If anyone ruined it, it wasn't me. Elena gripped my hand tightly, lowering her head to hide the tear that slipped free. I rose, picked up my clutch, and walked away from the table with measured steps. My heels struck the marble floor in steady rhythm. Every eye followed me again, but this time not with pity, rather with curiosity and admiration. Victor watched me leave, his lips twisting into a mocking smile, as if to claim victory. But I caught his eyes for the briefest moment, and in them, I saw the panic rising behind the mask. Julia was different. She lowered her head, avoiding every gaze. I could almost hear the frantic beating of her heart. Perhaps she had just realized she was nothing more than a pawn in Victor's game. And tonight that pawn had been dragged into the light. As I stepped out through the grand doors, I drew in a deep breath. The night air was cool against my hair, so different from the suffocating air inside. I did not cry. I did not scream. Instead, I felt a new current within me, a strength I had lost during all those years of avoiding conflict. Victor might believe he had won by parading his mistress before the crowd, but he didn't know. From the moment I placed that box on the table, the game had shifted, and this time, I was no longer a piece on the board. I was the player. When I left the banquet hall, the small box still lay on the table. I knew Victor couldn't resist. His pride, his hunger for control, his inability to let a mystery linger. He had never been able to stop himself. And I was right. Later, Elena told me that the moment I walked out, Victor rushed down from the stage and snatched the box. His hands trembled, as if he feared it might contain a bomb ready to blow his reputation apart. Julia, seated nearby, leaned closer, her brows furrowed. Unable to understand but sensing something was deeply wrong, Victor opened the box, and his face changed. Inside was no piece of jewelry, no sentimental keepsake, only a small silver USB and a bundle of papers neatly tied with a blue ribbon. I could picture every shift in his expression, from arrogance to confusion, then finally to ashen dread. I had lived with him for 30 years. I knew every habit, every twitch of his brow. And in that instant, he understood. I was no longer the silent wife he once commanded. Julia leaned in, whispering, "What is that, Victor?" He quickly shoved the papers into his jacket pocket, stammering, "And nothing. Just some old documents." But Julia wasn't easily convinced. I was certain she noticed his hand, shaking so violently the wine in his glass nearly spilled. Inside that bundle was a copy of the prenuptial agreement we had signed many years ago, a contract meant to protect us both should betrayal ever occur. Victor had always dismissed it as mere formality, a hollow comfort for me. But I thought differently. Paper and ink never lie. And the USB? It carried the evidence I had quietly gathered for months. Hotel invoices, bank statements, even security footage from a parking lot he had once frequented. Everything Victor believed hidden was now tucked into that tiny device. I didn't need to unveil it loudly before the crowd. Didn't need to scream in his face like some unhinged woman. That was no longer my way. I had planned this carefully, choosing instead to expose him indirectly, just enough to let him know the game had begun. Victor had always loved theatrics. He loved stages, applause, turning life into a performance. But this time, he was forced into a role he had never chosen, that of the loser in his own play. I sat in the car outside, watching the hotel's golden lights reflected in the windshield. I imagined Victor rifling through each page, cold sweat trickling down his back, while Julia stared wide-eyed, unable to comprehend why the man she trusted was suddenly unraveling. A night breeze swept through, carrying the soft fragrance of jasmine from a nearby planter. I closed my eyes and inhaled deeply. 4 years I had avoided conflict, had chosen silence in the name of peace. But the truth was, silence had only fed the lies. Now, I had chosen a different silence as strategy, not surrender. And I knew, tonight's small move was only the beginning. Elena later told me that while Victor fumbled with the papers, Trembling, she could no longer bear it. My daughter rose to her feet, walked toward her father, and spoke in a quiet but steady voice. Dad, did you ever really think about Mom when you did this? The entire hall fell silent. I could picture Elena's eyes so uncannily like mine fixed on Victor. She didn't scream, didn't accuse, only asked a single question. But sometimes, the simplest questions cut the deepest. Victor froze. He opened his mouth, then shut it again. The man who had just flaunted his mistress before hundreds of guests, who had puffed his chest claiming bravery, now stammered like a child. At last, he forced a weak smile and laid his heavy hand on his daughter's shoulder. Elena, you're still young. There are things you don't understand. But Elena didn't flinch. She brushed his hand aside, eyes brimming with tears, then turned back to her seat. In that moment, I knew another fracture had opened in my daughter's heart. Andrew was different. He remained where he was, staring intently at the USB in his father's hand. His eyes gleamed not with sorrow, but with calculation. He believed that no matter what, his father would handle it. I could almost hear his thoughts. Dad has survived dozens of tough deals. What's a USB or a few papers? He'll sweep it all away, and I'll get the shares he promised me. I felt a pang of sorrow, though not surprise. Andrew had grown up in Victor's shadow, dazzled by the power his father projected. He had yet to learn that power built on lies will always collapse. Meanwhile, I sat in the car out in the parking lot, my hands resting on the steering wheel. The glass reflected my own face unnervingly calm. I whispered to myself, as though speaking to the shadow in the mirror, he only knows how to strike fast. I play the long game. That was the difference between us. Victor was always impatient, craving spectacle, addicted to applause. He believed that if he created enough drama, people would be swept up and he would win. But I had learned another way. Silence, preparation, and the strike at the right moment. Inside that glittering hall, Victor was surely masking his trembling with a strained smile. Julia was bewildered, Elena wounded, and Andrew still lost in his fantasies of power. But in the dark stillness of my car, I knew the real game had begun. And this time, I wasn't playing just for myself, I was playing for my children, so they would understand the value of truth and dignity. I turned the key. The engine hummed softly to life. Inside me, instead of fear, there was a strange calm, peace, because I knew the road ahead would bring storms. But this time, I was ready to walk straight into them. The truth never falls from the sky. It always leaves fragments, tiny cracks that, if one pays attention, can be seen. I remembered 6 months ago. It was a sweltering summer afternoon, and I was sitting at my desk, going over the family accounts as I often did. I was never the prying type, but for years I had kept the habit of checking the numbers, just to make sure we weren't overspending. That day, among dozens of familiar transactions, I noticed a strange payment. A hotel in the city center, its name familiar yet one I had never booked. The amount wasn't small, and what caught my attention was the frequency. It appeared every few weeks. But first, I reassured myself. Perhaps it was a cost for a client. Perhaps the company paid it by mistake. But suspicion crept in, like a cold draft slipping through a window crack. I began to pay closer attention. One time, Victor told me, "I have a sudden business trip. Just a few days." I nodded, as always. But after he left, I tried opening one of his secondary email accounts on the old computer he had abandoned in his office. And there, I found the receipt, his name, a double room, at that very hotel. My heart clenched tight, not because I had never suspected, but because at last suspicion had a form, a record, a legal weight. I didn't stop there. I drove to the parking lot near the hotel, where I knew a guard from years past. After a cup of coffee and some small talk, he pointed me to a snippet of camera footage. And there, on the grainy screen, was a familiar figure. Victor stepping out of his car. Beside him a woman with brown hair, Julia. The name wasn't clear then, but I knew. The woman who worked with my daughter. A piece that fit into the place I had dreaded most. I drove home, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. In the rearview mirror, I saw my own face no longer weeping, only steeped in a silence that chilled me. I didn't scream, didn't call to confront him, didn't tell anyone. I knew the truth I had glimpsed was only the beginning. And if I wanted to stand firm, I would need more than emotion. I needed proof. In the months that followed, Victor continued speaking of business trips. Andrew, my dear boy, always looked at his father with pride. Dad works so hard for the family, Mom, he once told me, his voice firm. I looked at my son, my heart tightening. He saw his father's constant absences as proof of effort, of responsibility. He didn't understand or refused to understand that those absences were proof of another kind of betrayal. I didn't blame Andrew. At his age, I had once believed in the image Victor had built. A man of iron will, who gave everything for his career and his family. But I had learned that sometimes everything is just an excuse. A curtain to hide the shadows one doesn't want to face. Each receipt, each video clip, each lie about business trips I recorded became pieces of a puzzle. And I knew that one day I would need to assemble them into a complete picture. A picture Victor could not deny. Elena was not easily fooled. She had keen instincts, and sometimes I caught her looking at her father with suspicion. Once, when Victor slammed the door and left for a so-called business trip, Elena turned to me and quietly asked, Mom, don't you think something's wrong with Dad? Don't you see it? I remember hesitating. My heart wanted to shout, yes, dear, your father is betraying us. But reason stopped me. I only put a hand on her shoulder and sighed. Don't worry about it. Focus on your work. I will handle it. Elena watched me for a moment, sadness in her eyes. She had a hunch, but she was also a dutiful daughter. She did not want to confront her father directly, especially since at work Julia, her assistant, still showed up every day as if nothing had happened. I knew my daughter was trapped between duty and truth, so she chose silence. I did not. For the first time in many years, I stopped avoiding things. I became determined. I kept a private file, carefully locked in a drawer. Inside I filed each invoice, each bank statement, each printout from the cameras. I bought an external hard drive and backed everything up. I even taught myself how to encrypt files, something I never would have imagined doing 10 years ago. While I moved cautiously, Victor grew carelessly confident. He became boastful, even contemptuous. I heard him brag to friends at dinner. Men need their pleasures. My wife's so gentle, she never suspects. That's the kind of woman who understands her place. I sat beside him, taking sips of wine to hide the chill that ran down my spine. He thought I didn't know. He thought my silence meant I was foolish. In truth, that silence was becoming a tightening net around him. His contempt for me and for Elena only hardened my resolve. Whenever I heard his footsteps leave with a suitcase, I would sit at my desk, open my laptop, and keep collecting. Piece by piece, the betrayal picture took shape. The contrast became stark. Victor clumsy and overconfident, certain that no one knows, while I was silent, patient, and relentless. That difference would decide the final outcome. One evening I looked in the mirror and saw someone different, no longer the woman who avoided conflict and feared confrontation. My eyes were brighter, steadier. I whispered to the reflection, enough. This time, I will not let him get away. There are nights, when the house grows to quiet, that I sit by the window and let my memories roll back. I see myself in my 20s, hands stained with paint, eyes alight as I stood before unfinished canvases. I once dreamed of opening a small gallery, a place to hang my own works and those of young artists who had yet to be discovered. Back then, Victor would often stop by the studio with a cup of hot coffee. He would stand amid the canvases and say, Nora, you're talented. But when we get married, I'll need you by my side. We can't split our strength. You know, a man who wants to go far needs a wife who's completely devoted. I listened and believed him. I set aside my brushes, my palettes, telling myself I was only postponing my dream. Just a few years, I thought. But a few years turned into decades. While I buried my passion, Victor lived under the glare of applause. He loved the crowds clapping, the handshakes, the title of successful man. I once thought it was ambition, but slowly, I realized it was an addiction, one more dangerous than alcohol. Victor never knew how to back down. Lose one deal, and he'd double his bet on the next. Hear one criticism, and he'd throw a grand party to prove them wrong. He couldn't retreat, wouldn't retreat, and worse. He took my silence as a given. She'll never talk back. Elena, my daughter, carries much of me inside her. She is disciplined, hard-working, principled. But like me back then, she fears confrontation. I see it in the way she lowers her head when her father grows angry. The way she chooses silence in meetings, rather than face conflict. Each time I look at Elena, it's like looking into a mirror. The woman who once thought avoidance was the same as keeping the peace. But what peace? Avoidance only invites others to push further, only buries pain for longer. I had paid for that illusion with 30 years of my life, and now, I refuse to let my daughter repeat it. I remember Elena telling me after a meeting, I was going to tell Dad Julia wasn't right for the project. But then, I stayed quiet. I was afraid he'd think I was trying to sabotage her. I hugged her, my heart aching. I knew that feeling too well, but I also realized, if I kept silent, I would teach her that endurance was the only way to survive. And that would be the worst lesson a mother could give her daughter. Those nights, I would look around the vast house Victor was so proud of. The walls lined with awards, photos of him shaking hands with dignitaries. Yet the emptiness echoed cold, and I whispered to myself, enough. If I keep silent, I will be nothing but a shadow, and Elena will be too. Andrew was nothing like his sister. From a young age, he idolized Victor. He loved listening to his father talk about deals, profits, power. In my son's eyes, Victor was never wrong. Others were simply slower, weaker, less capable. I remember when Andrew turned 20, he boasted to me, Dad said one day he'll give me 10% of the shares. I just need to be patient, follow him, and I'll be like him. His words chilled me, not because my son longed for success, but because he was learning to believe that happiness only came from ownership. That loyalty could be bought with promises of wealth. Andrew was becoming a younger version of his father, calculating, greedy, always asking what's in it for me. Many nights, I watched my son in animated conversation with Victor, the two of them mirroring one another. While Elena pulled back, Andrew pressed forward, seizing what he thought was his future. And suddenly, I realized, if I kept silent, if I allowed Victor to go on defining this family, I would lose both my children. One would repeat my mistake, the other would become his father's shadow. I sat alone in the living room, the yellow light casting shadows across the wall lined with family photos. In them, I always stood slightly to the side, smiling gently. Victor stood in the center, radiant, a trophy in his hand or shaking hands with someone important. I looked at those photos and understood I had let myself become the backdrop. No, I whispered, my voice echoing in the empty room. If I stay silent, I'll be nothing but a shadow. That was the moment I knew I had to change. I was no longer the woman who avoided conflict, no longer willing to accept truth buried beneath the pretense of peace. I remember the feeling of that decision clearly. It wasn't loud. It wasn't fierce like a thunderclap. It was like an underground river, flowing deep and steady, until it finally overflowed its banks. A calm resolve, but a turning point nonetheless. From that day, I began to prepare. Every receipt, every video clip, every line in the postnuptial contract, I arranged them carefully. Like a chess player patiently waiting for the right move. I was no longer passively letting Victor decide where I went. I had become the one setting the pieces. That night, For the first time in years, I looked into the mirror and saw a different Nora. My eyes were no longer sad. In their place was a steady, determined gaze. The woman who once stayed silent was gone. The woman who would take control had just been born. The first person I thought of when I decided to act was not a close friend, not family, but Parker Johnson. Parker and I had known each other since university. While I chose the path of art and later abandoned it to follow Victor, he remained steadfast in law, climbing step by step until he became one of the city's most respected attorneys. We hadn't met often over the years, but whenever we did, I always saw in Parker an integrity that could not be shaken. One morning, I arranged to meet him at a small cafe tucked in a quiet corner of town. I sat waiting, my palms damp with sweat, even though I had prepared myself, speaking aloud. The intention of divorcing after more than 30 years of marriage weighed heavily on my chest. Parker walked in, dressed in a light gray suit, his face as stern as ever. He sat across from me, looking directly at me. "Nora, it's been a long time. You look different." I gave a faint smile. "Different in what way?" "Your eyes. More determined, but carrying sorrow, too." I was silent for a moment, then slid the USB and the file across the table toward him. "Parker, I need your help. I want a divorce." He didn't look surprised, nor did he rush to open the file. He simply asked, "Are you sure? Once you take this step, there's no turning back." I nodded, my voice firm. "I've lived half my life in the shadows. I refuse to let the rest be the same." Parker opened the file, examining each document, each receipt, each camera photo. He gave no commentary, only nodded now and then. Then he plugged the USB into his laptop, scrolling through the data. After a few minutes, he looked up, his expression grave. "This is clear evidence of infidelity. I can file for divorce immediately, along with an emergency motion to temporarily freeze his assets. But Nora, you need to understand I will proceed strictly by the book. No loopholes, no games. Do you agree?" I smiled. "That's exactly why I came to you. Victor has always loved finding loopholes for quick wins. I want to win with the truth." We signed the papers, and the moment the pen touched the page, I felt a heavy weight lift from my heart. For the first time in years, I was no longer passively waiting for my husband to decide my future. I had signed my own fate with my own hand. While I prepared carefully, Victor kept throwing money around as if tomorrow would never come. He bought a new car, changed his watch, hosted lavish dinners for clients. Outsiders saw a man of success, but I knew better. It was only his way of drowning out the fear that was growing inside him. And I, quietly, began gathering my own capital, part from the modest savings I had guarded for years, part from the inheritance my mother left me. I set up a private trust, shielding it from Victor's reach. Every move, I calculated with care, like a chess player advancing one deliberate step at a time. When I left the cafe that day, Parker shook my hand, his eyes no longer just those of a liar but of an old friend who understood. "Nora, you can win, but more importantly, you'll find yourself again." I squeezed his hand tightly. Inside, I knew he was right, and for the first time in many years, I felt I was no longer alone. Andrew began to suspect when I quietly completed the purchase of a small house on the outskirts of town. I used long-term investment as an excuse, but I caught his eyes following me, curious, uneasy. One evening, while Victor was away, Andrew walked into the kitchen and found me going through paperwork. He stopped at the doorway, his voice low, tinged with hesitation. "Mom, what are you doing?" I saw some real estate files. I looked up, answering calmly, "Just a private savings plan." "Don't worry." He frowned, ready to ask more, then held back. I saw the conflict in his eyes, the desire to know, but the fear of knowing. Perhaps he already guessed a part of it, but Andrew was like his father in this way when faced with something uncomfortable. He chose to ignore it, hoping it would somehow work itself out. Elena, in contrast, sensed the change in me clearly. She often stopped by after work, and each time, she studied me longer than usual. "Mom," she once said, her eyes curious, "there's something different about you lately, like you're holding on to a strength I've never seen before." I laughed lightly, trying to brush it off. Maybe it's just the vitamins. But Elena didn't laugh. She kept watching me, as if trying to touch something deeper. I didn't explain. I knew my daughter needed to see me strong, but it wasn't yet time to draw her into the storm. In the following meetings, Parker and I refined the case files. At times, in flashes of anger, I suggested bold tactics, hiring someone to leak rumors, or secretly recording Victor's conversations. But Parker immediately shook his head. "Nora, I understand how you feel, but we won't take that path. You don't need tricks. You already have the truth, and the truth is enough." I sat still, looking at him. A part of me felt disappointed because truth often moves too slowly, and I had already lost so many years. But I also knew he was right. If I chose a crooked path, I would become like Victor, the man who always sought loopholes, always wanted to win by schemes. Parker closed the file with finality. "We will win, Nora, but we'll win with truth, not with tricks." I nodded, a new sense of resolve rising within me. For years, I had avoided conflict, but this time, I would face it. Not with noise, not with deceit, but with the one weapon Victor never expected: patience and truth. That night, as I left Parker's office, the night wind swept through my hair. I smiled. The battle had begun, and I, the woman who once stayed silent, was now the one placing every move. That night, the vast house lay in darkness, only a single lamp casting a soft yellow glow over the living room. I sat still on the sofa, my hand resting on an open book I wasn't reading. I knew the storm was coming. The door burst open, Victor's footsteps pounding down the hallway. He was no longer the polished businessman from the party. His tie hung loose, his shirt wrinkled, his eyes bloodshot with fury. In his hand was the familiar USB. He threw it onto the table, the metal clattering sharply. His voice came out in a hiss, each word squeezed through clenched teeth. "You're trying to destroy me, Nora. After everything I've given you?" I lifted my head to look at him, calm as though before me was only a raging wind, not the man who had once been my husband. I set the book aside and answered slowly, "You've done that yourself, Victor." All I did was shine a light. His face twitched, a mix of anger and confusion. He stepped closer, pointing at me. "Don't play the saint here. You think a few papers, a few blurry videos can bring me down? I'm Victor Davis. I built an empire, and you owe me everything." I gave a faint, cold smile. "Oh, have you forgotten who stood beside you from the start? Who gave up her own dreams to be your support? If anyone owes anything, it's you. You owe me 30 years of my life." Victor fell silent for a moment. He wasn't used to my resistance. In his mind, I had always been the gentle, enduring wife. My calm defiance now only enraged him further. He jabbed his finger at the USB. "You're not allowed to use it against me. I won't let you turn me into a joke." I looked at the USB gleaming under the lamp, then met his eyes. "You've already turned yourself into a joke, Victor. I just kept the proof. The truth doesn't need me to paint it. It's already clear." He gave a harsh, dry laugh. "The truth? No one cares about the truth. People only see the spotlight, and that spotlight is mine, not yours." I rose, facing him. Only a few steps separated us, but between us yawned the gulf of years. "You're wrong. Your spotlight is nothing but artificial light. Victor, I choose the real light." The words came out quiet but sharp as a blade. Victor stepped back, then clenched his fists, as if he might smash something to vent his rage. But he stopped, perhaps afraid of that tiny USB, the small thing powerful enough to set fire to his entire empire. I stood still, unshaken. In that moment, I knew, for the first time in his life, Victor saw me not as a shadow, but as a true opponent. His phone vibrated in his jacket pocket, again and again. The screen lit up with a name, Julia. He fumbled to pull it out, his hand trembling even as he tried to appear calm. I folded my arms, waiting. The rapid rhythm of missed calls rang out like knocking from another world. The world he was trying to force both me and Julia into. Victor looked at me, then at the USB on the table. For an instant, his face flickered with panic. Answer Julia, or face Nora. He was stretched taut, like a man on a thin wire, one side his mistress, the other the family he had already shattered. He declined the call, but only seconds later the phone rang again. With a growl, he hurled it onto the chair, his bloodshot eyes blazing. She needs me. And you. You just want to destroy me. I kept my voice steady. No, Victor, you chose to destroy yourself. I'm only the witness. In that moment, memories of our children surged into my mind, as vividly as if they were standing there in the room with us. I saw Elena, my daughter, with questioning eyes, always restraining herself to avoid clashing with her father. I remembered the times she'd watch Victor leave on a business trip, then turn to me and whisper, "Mom, I'm not sure, but something's wrong with Dad." She was like me, once silent out of fear of hurting others, yet her gaze always probing. Then I saw Andrew, my son, sitting in the living room, eyes lighting up whenever his father spoke of shares and deals. In my memory, I heard his voice. "Dad knows what he's doing. He'll manage, Mom." His trust wasn't born of love but of ambition to inherit a piece of that false glory. Two children, two opposite paths, one suppressing suspicion, the other blinded by belief, and I, standing between them, knew that both would one day have to face the truth. The wind howled outside the window, whipping the curtains violently. Inside the vast house, we stood facing each other like opposing poles. Victor explosive, furious, always desperate to prove himself, and me silent, patient, choosing the light of truth. I saw the contrast clearly, like a storm raging between sky and earth. Victor was the storm, loud, destructive, uncontrollable. I was the earth, quiet, steady, unmoved by the hurricane. His voice broke through again, a growl. "You'll never win, Nora. You'll never beat me." I answered slowly, each word firm as stone. "Victor, this isn't a game of winning or losing. This is the truth, and no one can run from the truth forever." Outside, black clouds gathered, thunder rumbling in the distance. Inside, I knew the real storm had just begun, and this house would be the place it erupted. The next morning, the house felt shrouded in a heavy mist. I sat at the dining table, the file laid out in front of me. Victor entered, his shirt half buttoned, his face still etched with the marks of a sleepless night. In his hand was a cup of coffee, but his trembling fingers made it slosh against the rim. He threw me a contemptuous glance. "Nora, don't fool yourself into thinking you're smarter than me. That prenuptial agreement, it expired long ago. All you've got is a stack of useless paper." He leaned back in his chair, smirking. His laugh echoed hollowly, but he believed he had cornered me. I looked at him calmly. Then, from the leather folder on the table, I pulled out a fresh set of documents neatly sealed in a plastic sleeve. Sliding them toward him, I spoke evenly. "You're right, Victor. The original agreement did expire, but you forgot one thing. I never let it go." Victor frowned, dragging the file closer. The moment his eyes landed on the bright red notary seal at the end of the addendum, I saw the color drain from his face. His lips pressed tight, his skin paled, his eyes widened in disbelief. "This? Since when?" His voice rasped. "4 years ago." I answered simply. "I renewed the contract and had it notarized. This time, you can't deny it." He clenched the paper so hard it crumpled. then lifted his gaze to me, anger and panic colliding in his expression. For years, Victor had believed I was weak, easily placated. Only now did he realize I had been a step ahead of him all along. Just then, a knock came at the door. Julia poked her head in, her face hastily made up, her eyes still shining with expectation. "Victor, I thought we should discuss." She stopped abruptly when her gaze fell on the papers in his hand. Her eyes flicked quickly from Victor to me, then locked on the crimson seal. Julia's voice trembled, but suspicion sharpened it. "What is that?" Victor hastily shoved the papers behind his back, forcing a smile. "Nothing important. Go, Julia." But she had already seen the tremor in his movements. Her eyes narrowed, her tone rising. "Nothing important. Victor, what are you hiding from me?" The air in the room thickened. I didn't need to say another word. I just sat still, letting the truth seep into the space between them on its own. Victor stammered. "Julia, don't misunderstand. This is just an old formality." But Julia's eyes stayed locked on him. In her gaze, I saw a fracture beginning to form, a crack no lie could mend. I took a slow sip of tea, keeping my silence. In this game, shouting wasn't always necessary. Sometimes, all you had to do was place the right piece of paper on the table, and the rest would collapse by itself. Julia stood in the doorway, arms folded, waiting for an explanation. Victor's face flushed as he tried to shove the papers into his briefcase as if no one had noticed. But I knew Julia's eyes had already read more than he imagined. Setting my cup down, my voice cut through their tension, calm and clear. "Victor, you haven't just lied to me. You've lied to your mistress as well." The room fell silent. Julia's eyes widened, as though I had spoken aloud the suspicion she'd been swallowing for months. Victor swung toward me, his face flushed, veins rising in his neck. "Enough, Nora," he roared, slamming his hand on the table so hard the USB rattled. "Don't act like some saint. You think a few papers can bury me? I'm Victor Davis. I still run the company, still have a voice, still have everything." I leaned slightly forward, resting my arm on the chair, watching him as one watches an actor performing the last scene of a play. "You can shout as loud as you like, Victor, but the law isn't afraid of shouting. Notarized is notarized. Addendums are legal. There is only one truth here. You've walked straight into the trap you thought you were clever enough to avoid." Victor panted, trying to rebuild his posture. He straightened his tie, sat up straighter, his voice gravelly but defiant. "I'll find a way out. I always do." I gave a thin smile. "Yes, you always wriggle out with loopholes and tricks. But this time, you're facing the law, and the law has no loophole for those who despise it." Julia stepped back, whispering almost to herself. "You've hidden this from me. Even this you've hidden from me?" Victor turned to her, straining to smile. "Julia, don't listen to her. It's just paperwork. You're still the one I choose." But I saw the change in Julia's eyes. Shock and disappointment slid in, creating a distance Victor could never bridge. I leaned back into my chair, serene, as though reading from a familiar script. In truth, that's exactly what it was. Every move here I had imagined long ago in front of me. Victor flailed inside his illusion of power, convinced that if he yelled louder, if he kept up the fawade, he wouldn't fall. But on the table, the notarized papers with their crimson seal and the gleaming USB were reality, legal, undeniable, immovable, and in that moment, I knew. The board had turned. The game was now mine. No storm is more painful than the one that breaks inside your own home. After the confrontation with Victor, I had braced myself for the legal battle. What I hadn't expected was that my children would be dragged into a battle of their own, a war between themselves. One evening, Elena came over, her face weary after work. She sat across from me, her eyes heavy. "Mom, I don't know what to do anymore," she said, her voice choked. "Julia is my assistant. Every day I have to see her, work with her, And now I know she's Dad's mistress. I want to stand by you, but I'm terrified that if I say anything, my career will collapse. I took her cold hand into mine. My love, no one will blame you for feeling torn. But morality and career don't always run together. You have to choose the path you can walk with your head held high. Before I could say more, Andrew walked in, his shirt faintly smelling of smoke and alcohol. He had caught part of the conversation and jumped in immediately. You don't have to make this such a big deal, Elena. Dad is still the one running the company. His shares, they'll all belong to this family eventually. You need to be more rational. Elena whipped around, fire in her eyes. What are you saying, Andrew? All you care about is shares? Dad betrayed Mom, betrayed this family. Andrew smirked, his tone sharp. And you're too naive. You think the world runs on morality? No, Elena. It runs on power and money. Mom lived in Dad's shadow for 30 years. And now you want to turn our whole family into a circus because of some lofty ideals? Their voices clashed, echoing through the living room. I sat there, my heart tightening. Part of me wanted to scream for them to stop, but another part knew some conflicts must explode before their true nature is revealed. Elena's fists clenched, tears shimmering in her eyes. You talk as if money is everything. Have you forgotten what Mom sacrificed so Dad could have his career? Have you forgotten who raised you, who cared for you every single day, every single year? Or to you, does all that amount to just 10% of shares? Andrew's face flushed as he shot back. And without Dad, how do you think we lived in this house? Without him, do you think we would have had a proper education? Worship Mom all you want, but don't deny the truth. Dad built all of this. Every word pierced me like a blade. My children, one crying out for ethics, the other clinging to profit. Both partly right, both dangerously blind. I drew a deep breath, then rose to my feet, my voice firm enough to slice through their shouting. Enough. They both froze, staring at me. I looked at Elena, then at Andrew. Elena, you are right to defend the truth. Andrew, you are right to think of the future. But both of you are wrong if you let this family tear itself apart just to prove who is right. They fell silent, though anger still burned in their eyes. And in that instant, I understood. My greatest battle wasn't against Victor, it was making sure my children didn't become enemies, just as the tension stretched tight as a drawn bow. There came a knock at the door. I went to answer, and there stood Thomas, Victor's younger brother. He wore a simple wool coat, and in his hands was a thick file of documents. Nora. Thomas gave a small nod, then glanced at Elena and Andrew. I think the time has come. Truth can no longer be hidden. We sat around the dining table, the warm yellow light casting tense shadows on each face. Thomas opened the thick file and spread out sheets of evidence. Bank statements, hotel invoices, photos of Victor and Julia in public. Not only the things I had collected, but more proof Thomas had been quietly keeping for months. Elena stared at the photos, her eyes blazing now, no longer hesitant. She gripped my hand tightly, her voice firm. Mom, I'll stand with you. I can't stay silent anymore. Andrew leaned back in his chair, his face drained of color. He held a sheet of paper, reading it over and over before setting it down, his voice unsteady. But maybe Dad had a reason. Maybe it was just a moment's weakness? Thomas cut him off, his gaze cold and sharp. Andrew, I know you love your father, but look at the truth. This isn't a moment's mistake. It's a deliberate chain of lies. If you keep clinging to promises of shares, you'll become nothing but his shadow and lose yourself in the process. Thomas's words landed like a hammer. Andrew lowered his head, silent. I saw his shoulders trembling. He was torn between blind loyalty and the undeniable evidence in front of him. Elena turned to her brother, her tone fierce but resolute. How much longer will you stay blind? This is proof, not rumor. We have to choose the right side. Andrew's fists clenched, but he didn't answer. In his eyes, I saw a storm churning. He wasn't ready to turn against his father, but he no longer had the ground to deny what was laid bare. I drew a deep breath, looking at them both. "My children," I said slowly, "from here on, this family will split into two pots. Your father has chosen lies. I choose truth. The question is, who will you walk with?" The silence was suffocating. Elena nodded hard, without a trace of doubt. Andrew lowered his gaze, his hand trembling over the file. He said nothing, but I knew he was wavering in that moment. The portrait of our family was stark. A father sinking in lies, a mother forced into clarity, two children torn between self-interest and justice. And I understood this was only the beginning of that divide. The day I stepped into court, I felt like a different woman. No longer the wife who once sat waiting for her husband in loneliness, but a plaintiff armed with a full, carefully prepared case file. Parker walked beside me, carrying the heavy leather briefcase. He didn't need to say much, just a single nod was enough to strengthen my resolve. We had rehearsed every step. How to present, how to respond. The evidence files were neatly arranged, each item clearly marked. When we entered the courtroom, Victor was already there. He looked nothing like his usual glamorous self. He still wore an expensive suit, but his face was tense, his hand fiddling with a pen, as if to mask its trembling. Beside him sat a young attorney, tall and lean, his slicked back hair gleaming but his eyes betraying inexperience. Victor glanced at me and forced a mocking smile, as if to remind me, the game isn't over. But I didn't care. I sat down, took a deep breath, and felt an unexpected calm wash over me. The judge entered, the gavel striking. "The parties may present." Victor's lawyer rose first. His voice quivered slightly, though he tried to sound firm. "Your Honor, the postnuptial agreement submitted by the plaintiff has long expired. Therefore, the request to freeze assets has no legal basis." Victor nodded eagerly beside him, as though clinging to a lifeline. I remained still, my hands resting in my lap, waiting. Then Parker stood. His voice was deep, steady, and carried across the room with authority. "Your Honor, it is true that the original postnuptial agreement had a term. However, we have a renewal addendum, lawfully notarized for years ago. I submit it now for the court's review." He placed the file before the judge, sliding it across. I saw Victor stiffen, while his young lawyer flipped frantically through documents. Sweat breaking across his brow, the judge skimmed, then paused at the crimson notary seal. He lifted his gaze, his voice firm. "This postnuptial agreement is valid. The request to freeze shares and assets of the respondent is hereby granted, pending trial." The room fell silent. Victor shot to his feet, shouting, "No, this can't be. This is a setup." Silence in the courtroom. The gavel struck again, heavy as a blade. I looked at Victor, saw his face pale, his lips trembling but unable to form words. His usual confident, arrogant mask crumbled in an instant. Beneath the table, I gave Parker's hand a light squeeze. He nodded slightly. Yes, this was only the preliminary hearing, but we had already secured the crucial step, locking down the very assets Victor thought he could manipulate at will inside me. Instead of noisy triumph, there was only a quiet, steady feeling. The truth had begun to speak for itself. Victor nearly sprang from his chair, his voice booming across the courtroom. "You can't do this to me. I am Victor Davis. I built this company. I have the work, the reputation." He wasn't speaking. He was shouting, his hands flailing, his eyes bloodshot. The scene stirred the courtroom. Some shook their heads, others leaned to whisper to one another. But I sat still, both hands resting lightly on my lap, my back straight, my face calm. I didn't need to say a word. In that space, my silence carried farther than all his shouting. The judge struck the gavel again. "Mr. Davis, if you continue to disturb the order of this court, I will have you removed." Victor froze, but kept muttering under his breath like a man trying to swallow a bitter truth. He slumped back into his seat, his face burning, his fingers drumming wildly on the table. I felt a gaze from behind me. When I turned slightly, I saw Julia sitting in the back row. Her face was chalk white, her makeup unable to mask her panic. Her hands clutched her handbag so tightly her knuckles had turned pale. I knew then Julia had just realized what she'd been avoiding all along. Victor was no longer a safe harbor. The man who had promised her a future, protection, love was now having his power stripped away piece by piece before her eyes. Parker slid the file back toward me, his eyes giving a small signal. "We're good." I gave a slight nod. Inside, there was no gloating, only something else, as if I were watching justice rise to its feet after a long sleep. Each strike of the judge's gavel felt like nails being driven into an as-yet unread verdict. Shares frozen, assets temporarily sealed, a bell ringing through the room, announcing that this time, truth was at the wheel. Victor bowed his head, muttering something I couldn't make out. For him, the world he knew, the world where he roared and everyone obeyed, had collapsed. And I remained silent. A silence no longer of avoidance, but of power. I knew clearly, from this moment on, the scales of justice had tilted to my side. And Victor had lost control. Rumors moved faster than any official announcement. Just days after the preliminary hearing, the whole office buzzed about Victor's assets being frozen. Julia no longer showed up with her usual bright smile. Instead, she looked worn, avoiding colleagues' eyes. I was not surprised. The court had struck at what Victor had promised her: money and power. With no shares to split, no platform to flaunt, Victor became an empty man. And Julia, who had thought she'd found an escape, was being pulled back into the pit she had once fled. I learned from Elena, after all, Julia was still my daughter's assistant, that Julia had confided in a close friend. Elena repeated one line that made me pause for a long time. I was just repeating a tragedy I once ran away from. It turned out Julia's past was not simple. She had told them that in her 20s a superior had taken advantage of her and nearly destroyed her career. Julia had run from that city, vowing never to let herself fall into the same loop again. Yet now, standing beside Victor, she had become a lover, someone dependent on a man's lies and power. I pictured Julia's face when she said that, bitter and desperate. There is nothing more painful than realizing you are reliving an old tragedy. Then one morning I opened my email and found a new message. From Julia Carter. My heart skipped. I clicked it open, cautious and curious. Her message was brief and to the point. Mrs. Nora, I no longer want to stand with him. I was deceived both emotionally and financially. Here is what I can share: some internal emails, secret appointment logs, and documents Victor hid from the board. Please use them. I am not doing this to win against you, but to free myself. I read it again and again, not because I doubted her, but because I felt the tremor in every word. This was the first time Julia chose truth over lies. I leaned back, closed my eyes. Part of me felt relieved. Any piece of evidence moved me one step forward. But another part ached. Julia was no longer just the other woman. She was a young woman who had fallen into the trap Victor set, and now had to claw her way out with fresh wounds. I whispered to myself, perhaps we are all just women learning to stand up after we have lost too much. Word that Julia had sent documents reached Victor quickly. He called me in the middle of the night, his voice hoarse with wine and fury. Traitor. Julia is a poisonous snake. She will pay for turning her back on me. I held the phone away from my ear, letting his shouting spill into the void. Finally, I spoke one sentence, my voice even and calm. Victor, have you forgotten? The first betrayal was yours. I hung up, my heart no longer trembling as it once did, because the truth was simple. He had betrayed me, betrayed our family, and even betrayed the promises he had whispered to Julia. The next day, I happened to run into Julia in the company hallway on my way to meet Parker. She was pressed against a corner, clutching her handbag, her face drawn and pale as if she'd just weathered a long fever. When she saw me, She took a small step back, her eyes flickering with shame and fear. I'm not doing this to help you, she stammered. I just can't take it anymore. I can't keep living in lies. I nodded, my voice softening. Julia, I don't see you as someone who's won or lost. You're just another woman, hurt the way I once was. The only difference is how we choose to face it. She stared at me, startled, then lowered her gaze. I caught a glimmer of tears at the corner of her eye before she turned quickly and hurried down the hall. I stood there, my heart heavy. In Julia I saw a fragment of my own past, young, trusting, easily tripped. But I also saw the difference. Julia was young. She chose to run from pain, from mistakes. And I, older now, seasoned by scars, chose to face it. That night, sitting alone by the window, I reflected on our brief encounter. I didn't feel triumph, only another scratch in the larger picture of women, fighting to find an escape in a world built on deceit. I whispered to myself, running or facing, these are the two paths, and I know only one of them can lead to true freedom. It took only a few days for the news to spread, and not from me. Victor's rivals seized the chance, splashing the scandal across headlines. The front page of the Business Chronicle showed Victor's half-smile of confidence, paired with the bold caption, "Model entrepreneur or betrayer? Victor Davis accused of infidelity and financial fraud." I sat in the kitchen, reading the article under the harsh white light. In every line, I could see the hand of those who had long waited for Victor to stumble. They didn't need my help. Victor himself had handed them enough ammunition to fire. The phone rang non-stop. I didn't answer, but the texts told me everything. "Nora, did you see the morning paper?" Hard to believe he fell this fast. At company headquarters, Ms. Ramirez, the chairwoman of the board, wasted no time. She was known for her pragmatism, her steel. In an emergency meeting, she stood and declared, her voice sharp as a blade, "We cannot let Davis Corporation sink with Mr. Victor Davis. I hereby suspend all his executive duties until an official conclusion is reached." I wasn't there, but Parker told me later. Victor sat pale, trying to protest, but his voice quivered, carrying no weight. And then came the final blow. A major partner the corporation Victor had courted for 3 years sent a formal letter canceling their contract. The reason was blunt. "We do not collaborate with leadership entangled in ethical and legal scandals." When I heard, I sat quietly in the living room. On the table lay the open newspaper. Beneath it, the old wedding photo of Victor and me in its wooden frame. In the picture, I was young, full of hope. Victor's eyes burned with pride. I touched the glass lightly, then exhaled a long sigh. His reputation, the thing he loved more than this family, had crumbled not in silence, but under the harsh glare of public judgment. And the bitter truth was, he hadn't needed enemies to topple him. He had burned his own monument. A week later, as Victor's name became a fixture in every scandal, I was contacted by a female journalist from Her Voice magazine. They didn't want a tabloid spectacle, but a portrait of a wife rising from betrayal. The shoot took place in the old art studio I had once dreamed of opening. I wore a simple deep blue dress, standing in the late afternoon light. The photographer told me to lift my head, no need to smile. And so that image, a woman with resolute eyes, lines of age etched deep, yet full of life, appeared on the magazine cover that week. The headline read, "Nora Davis, from the shadow behind her husband to a symbol of women's strength." I read the article in silence. Not pride, not gloating, just the sense that at last, light had reached the corner where I had lived for so many years. Andrew, when he saw the magazine, sat silent for hours. He had idolized his father, believing him the great man who could never fall. Now that idol lay shattered, I caught the lost look in my son's eyes as he held the paper, as though he no longer knew what to cling to. Elena was different. Showing me an online article, she smiled with relief. "Mom, the truth is finally out. I don't have to doubt in silence anymore." I held my daughter's hand. feeling the strength slowly rising within her. Elena was no longer the girl who only knew how to avoid conflict. And Victor, his image in the papers was the stark opposite. A photo captured him leaving company headquarters, head bowed, surrounded by reporters. No more burning eyes, no more confident stride. Only an aging, heavy man stripped of everything. That was the moment I understood. Light and shadow don't merely coexist. They are always fighting to replace one another. He had chosen deceit and illusion, and in the end, the darkness consumed him. I chose the truth, and now I stepped into the light. As the legal battle gained its momentum, I allowed myself to think of something extravagant, a dream. For years, it had been like a box shoved into a dark corner, gathering dust. Now, I opened that box. I decided to build a small gallery. I rented an old building downtown, its wooden floors creaking, its walls cracked. But when I stood in that room, sunlight pouring through tall windows onto bare white walls, my heart stirred with a rhythm I thought I had lost forever. On opening day, I trembled like a young girl making her debut. The paintings, some mine, some from young artists I wanted to support, hung on the walls while I stood still, quietly hoping. But the exhibition quickly doused me with cold water. Fewer visitors than expected. A few critics stepped in, glanced around, and whispered, "Good materials, but weak composition. Very amateur." I heard it all. Each word pierced like a needle. The paintings I had nurtured like children of my spirit were dismissed as novice experiments. When the evening ended, I sat alone in the empty gallery. Neon lights cast harsh beams over abandoned canvases. The last footsteps faded, leaving behind a heavy silence. I rested my head on the table, stroking an old painting I had made decades ago. Shaky brushstrokes, clumsy colors in my head. An old whisper returned. Maybe I'm not good enough. Maybe Victor was right. The world out there is too harsh. Maybe silence is easier. The old habit of avoidance, the safe shell I had wrapped around myself for decades, crept back. I felt small, foolish, ready to pack everything up and shut the gallery forever. I whispered into the dark, maybe I should stop. Again. And in that moment, I realized rebirth isn't only about standing up. It's about learning not to collapse again. Yet I hadn't found that strength. Not yet. That evening, as I sat in the hollow gallery, Elena walked in. She carried a small box of pastries and 2 cups of hot coffee. Setting them on the table, she pulled up a chair beside me. "Mom," she said gently, "I know today was hard, but one failed exhibition doesn't mean your dream has failed. Art isn't something you do once and stop." I looked into her eyes so full of belief, the kind I had long lost in myself. She continued, "I know some collectors. They're still looking for new artists who really have a story to tell. I'll connect you, but you have to promise me don't give up just because the first time didn't go your way." I held her hand, warmth spreading through my palm. "Elena, I gave up once, for 30 years. I won't repeat it." Andrew was there too. He didn't speak, just sat in the corner, hands in his pockets, eyes quietly scanning the paintings. I didn't need words to understand. Perhaps for the first time, he was seeing me not as Dad's shadow, but as someone with a dream of her own. The next week, Elena kept her promise. She brought a few collectors to see the gallery. They didn't scoff like the critics had. Instead, they lingered long before a canvas of a field I had painted in some of my darkest days. One of them turned and said, "There's truth in these brushstrokes. It's not perfect, but it's alive." My heart trembled not because they praised me, but because they had seen what I had put into it, the truth. The second exhibition was a different world. The gallery filled with people, voices echoing against the walls. By the end of the evening, every painting had found a buyer. I stood there, my eyes blurred with tears, hardly able to believe it. Each and every piece had been embraced. Elena held me tightly, whispering, "I told you, you just needed a second chance." Andrew stepped forward, saying nothing, only giving me a quiet nod. In his eyes, I saw a respect he had never shown me before. I lifted my head and looked at the walls now bare because every painting had been sold. Empty, but no longer heavy. For the first time in decades, I felt my dream was no longer buried. The contrast was sharp, from the sting of that first failure to the glow of this success. But I understood this rise only had meaning because of the fall before it. Rebirth isn't a straight line. It's an arc, moving through darkness to find the light again. I heard from Thomas before I saw it myself. Victor had been forced to move out of the mansion, into a small rented apartment on the outskirts of town. No chauffeur, no assistant to manage his schedule. He carried his own bags, placed his own delivery orders, living like the kind of ordinary middle-aged man he had always despised. I felt no triumph, only a chill, as if watching a castle collapse under a storm, its bricks scattering into dust. Victor turned to alcohol. Neighbors said he staggered out of the convenience store every night, with a bottle of whiskey in hand. Sometimes he sat on the steps until dawn, muttering words no one could quite catch. The cruelest loss wasn't his money or his reputation. It was when he tried calling his children. I knew, because Elena told me. Her phone rang while she was at work, Dad flashing across the screen. She stared at the glowing light until it went dark, then lit up again, and darkened once more. "Elena, answer it," I whispered, seeing her face tighten. But she shook her head, eyes red. "Mom, I can't. I have nothing left to say to him." I understood. The true price of betrayal wasn't the forfeited fortune, it was the loss of the hands that once wanted to hold his. At that small apartment, Victor's calls to Andrew fared no better. My son didn't reject him outright, but he let the phone ring until it cut off. He was still torn, still conflicted, but I knew distance had already settled between them. The Victor of yesterday, standing at a podium, gripping a microphone, basking in applause with fire in his eyes, was now reduced to an aging man, clutching a phone in the dark, trembling as each unanswered ring echoed into silence. At night, he sat by the apartment window, draining the bottle. Outside, the city lights shimmered. Inside, only shadows remained. I knew Andrew wrestled fiercely before making his choice. My son, blinded so often by loyalty, still carried a fragile heart for the man who had once promised him the whole sky. One evening, he admitted to me, eyes fixed on the floor. "Dad called. Mom," he said, "he just wanted to see me, just once." I almost picked up, but then I remembered what he did to you. I couldn't. His voice trembled, as if begging me to forgive him for what he couldn't give. I laid a hand on his shoulder and whispered, "Andrew, you are not the one who abandoned him. He abandoned you long ago." And that was the last time Victor still clung to the hope that his son might be his anchor. When Andrew turned away, he lost the final pillar tying him to the family. They said Victor tried to quit drinking. He even signed up for a few support group meetings, but never made it through one. The moment anyone mentioned admitting mistakes, he would storm out and reach again for his familiar bottle of whiskey. To him, admitting was bowing his head, and Victor Davis had never learned to bow to anyone. Those days, his small apartment grew more suffocating. Empty bottles lined up under the sink. The television glared all night, replaying reports of his scandal as though mocking him. He sat still in the flickering blue light, gaunt and hollow-eyed. Meanwhile, on the other side of the city, I lived a very different life. My gallery began drawing steady visitors. My days filled with meetings, conversations with people who truly cared about art. I felt myself awakening again, like a withered tree suddenly watered, sprouting green shoots. The contrast was stark. Victor adrift in a dark apartment, drowning in alcohol and isolation. Me, standing in a brightly lit room, painting anew, my hands steady, my eyes clear. He sank deeper into shadow, and I, at last, found the dawn. The day of the final trial dawned strangely clear. I sat in the courtroom, calm, as if this was nothing more than a necessary formality. Parker leaned close and whispered, "Our case is solid. Today it ends. Victor sat across from me. He looked gaunt, his expensive suit now hanging loosely on his frail frame. The proud glint in his eyes was gone, replaced only by a weary stubbornness. The judge read the verdict, each word sharp and steady. Mrs. Nora Davis is granted the marital home, 75% of the assets, and the majority of company shares. Mr. Victor Davis retains only the remaining portion and is stripped of all executive positions. The words fell like a gavel striking down an entire era. I did not cheer. I did not cry. I simply exhaled, a release that felt strangely light. Victor gave a faint nod. His lips pressed tight. He did not protest anymore. He merely gathered the scraps of his papers and stood. As he walked out, I watched the silhouette of a man who once thought himself untouchable, now leaving quietly with nothing but a small apartment and a dwindling fortune. His downfall was complete not by anyone's hand but his own. Months later, I opened my official gallery. This time, there was no hesitation. I restored the old building, completely whitewashed walls, sunlight pouring through tall windows. The works hung in order, some painted in nights of despair, others blazing with new color. On opening day, reporters crowded the entrance, but they did not ask about Victor anymore. They asked about my journey, about art, about a woman reborn from ruin. I answered simply, I am not a victim. I am only someone who chose to rise when standing still meant disappearing. That evening, the headlines read, "The Nora Davis Gallery Where Art Meets Resilience." I stood in the bright room, listening to the hum of guests, watching my paintings being seen, being valued. I knew this was more than the opening of a gallery. It was the opening of a new life. When the crowd thinned and the gallery still glowed, I stood by the tall window, watching the flow of people outside. A strange feeling rose within me, familiar yet new. Familiar, because I had once dreamed of this moment in my youth. New, because the road that brought me here had wound through betrayal, collapse, and unyielding patience. Elena came to stand beside me, her arm resting gently on my shoulder. She did not need many words, just a smile. But in her eyes, I saw pride. She no longer saw me as the gentle, silent mother, but as a woman of strength, a living example. I still remember your first exhibition, Elena whispered. You sat there alone, and I was afraid you'd give up. But today, you've proven you're stronger than I ever imagined. I squeezed her hand, my heart swelling. Thank you for never giving up on me. Andrew was there that evening too. He stood apart, leaning against the far wall, quietly observing. I caught a glimpse of hesitation in him, as if he wasn't sure he dared step closer. But when most of the guests had left, he slowly walked toward me. Mom. His voice was low and rough. I turned, and in his eyes there was no defiance left, only exhaustion and regret. I understand now, he said, then suddenly wrapped his arms tightly around me. The embrace was so firm I could feel his heart racing. I believed Dad too much, and I nearly lost you. I'm sorry. I held my son close, without anger, without reproach. Andrew, you don't need to apologize. What matters is that you finally see the truth. That is the greatest gift you could give me. In that moment, I knew I had won, not only in the courtroom, but also in reclaiming my family. Later, when everyone gathered one last time around the podium, I stood up. The soft lights bathed the room in quiet stillness. I looked around, Elena standing near, Andrew beside her, Parker nodding with a smile, Thomas quietly in the back. Familiar faces, each one proof that I was no longer alone. I began, slow and steady. When one door closes, another opens. But the real question is, do you have the courage to walk through the new one? I paused, drawing a deep breath. I spent 30 years standing behind a man, believing silence would keep the peace. But silence only made me lose myself. Only when I dared to step into the light did I find freedom and the love of those truly by my side. Applause filled the room. I saw Elena wiping away tears, Andrew nodding, and Parker exhaling as though lifting a great weight from his chest. The next morning, I stepped onto the balcony of the house now legally mine. A brilliant sunrise spread across the city, golden orange light spilling over rooftops and streets. I closed my eyes, feeling its warmth on my skin. Somewhere else, I knew, Victor sat in his rented apartment, curtains drawn, swallowed by shadow. To worlds, to choices. He had chosen lies and darkness. I had chosen truth and light. When I opened my eyes, I smiled. That sunrise lit not only the sky, but my entire life. My dear friends, if this story has touched your heart, I invite you to leave a comment and share your thoughts or your own experiences. And don't forget to subscribe, so we can continue to listen, to tell, and to live through stories together, stories that may be yours, or perhaps someone you once knew.